Picture this. Somewhere over the fields of France in 1944, a tiny observation plane, barely bigger than a car, unarmed by design, meant only for scouting, banks sharply against a gray autumn sky. Below, a column of German Panther tanks rolls through the countryside, their crews confident in their thick armor plating, their superiority over anything the Allies might throw at them. These are some of the most feared machines of war ever built, nearly impervious to frontal assault. Then the little plane dives. What happens next shouldn't be possible. From beneath the wings of this fragile aircraft, 6 rockets streak downward in rapid succession, their trails cutting through the air like vengeful fingers. The tanks never see it coming. One by one, explosions tear through metal that was supposed to be invincible. The crews scramble, confused, looking for artillery that isn't there, searching the ground for anti-tank guns that don't exist. They never think to look up, not at something so small, so seemingly harmless. The man in that cockpit was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Carpenter, but the Germans came to know him by another name, Bazooka Charlie, and his weapon of choice was a plane that had no business carrying weapons at all. He didn't follow the rules of aerial combat. He didn't wait for orders or reinforcements. He hunted tanks the way a hawk hunts mice, alone and relentless, in an aircraft he'd personally modified into something the Army had never imagined. How does a pilot turn a defenseless observation plane into one of the most feared tank killers on the Western Front? What drives a man to repeatedly dive toward death in a machine held together by fabric and wishful thinking? Charles Carpenter didn't start the war as a soldier. He was a high school teacher from Riverside, Illinois, a man more comfortable with textbooks than with battlefield tactics. When America entered World War II, Carpenter was already in his mid-30s, older than the typical fresh-faced recruit, with a wife and family waiting at home. But like so many men of his generation, he felt the pull of duty, the sense that history was calling, and he couldn't ignore it. He joined the Army and was assigned to artillery observation, a role that required sharp eyes, steady nerves, and a willingness to fly low and slow over enemy lines. The aircraft he'd be flying was the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a military version of the civilian Piper Cub. To call it an airplane is generous. It was a tiny 2-seater with fabric-covered wings, a maximum speed of about 85 miles per hour, and absolutely no armor. It had no guns, no bombs, nothing to defend itself with. Its job was simple: fly over the battlefield, spot enemy positions, call in coordinates for the artillery boys on the ground, and pray you didn't get shot down. For most observation pilots, this was enough. They'd spend their missions high above the fighting, eyes glued to binoculars, radioing back information and getting out of there as fast as their little engines could carry them. But Carpenter wasn't most pilots. From his first missions over France in the summer of 1944, he became frustrated with his limitations. He could see the enemy tanks below, threatening American troops, and all he could do was report their positions and hope the artillery could get them in time. Often, they couldn't. Tanks moved fast, and by the time the shells arrived, the Germans had already repositioned. Carpenter started thinking, what if he didn't have to wait for someone else to do the job? What if his little observation plane could become something more? The idea came to him while watching infantrymen fire bazookas on the ground. The M9 bazooka was a revolutionary weapon, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher that could penetrate up to 3 inches of armor, enough to knock out most German tanks if you hit them in the right spot. Infantry loved them, but getting close enough to use one against a moving tank was practically a suicide mission. The effective range was only about 300 yards, and you had to be on the ground, exposed, hoping the tank crew didn't see you first. But what if you fired from above? Carpenter approached his commanding officers with his plan: mount bazookas on the wings of his L-4 Grasshopper. They thought he was insane. The plane wasn't built for ordnance. The recoil alone could tear the wings off or send the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin. And even if it worked mechanically, the tactical value was questionable. How many shots could he realistically get off before German anti-aircraft guns turned his fragile plane into confetti? Carpenter persisted. He argued that the element of surprise would be on his side. No one expected an observation plane to attack. The Germans wouldn't waste anti-aircraft ammunition on what looked like a harmless scout. And if he could get the modification right, he could strike from angles that ground-based bazookas never could, hitting the thin top armor of tanks rather than their heavily reinforced fronts. Eventually, someone up the chain of command decided to let him try. Working with mechanics and ordnance specialists, Carpenter designed a mounting system that attached 3 bazookas to each wing of his Grasshopper, for a total of 6 rockets per mission. The tubes were fixed to fire forward and slightly downward. Inside the cockpit, he installed electrical switches that would trigger the rockets individually or in volleys. The whole setup was jury-rigged, experimental, and completely unauthorized by any official Army manual. Carpenter named his modified aircraft Rosie the Rocketer, painting the name on her nose along with a cartoon of a woman riding a rocket. He was the only pilot certified, if you could call it that, to fly her. No one else wanted the job. Carpenter's first combat mission in Rosie the Rocketer took place in September of 1944, during the Allied advance through France. Intelligence reported a column of German Panther tanks moving to reinforce defensive positions. Carpenter took off before dawn, climbing to several thousand feet to scout their location. Through his binoculars, he spotted them. 5 Panthers rolling in formation along a rural road, their long 75mm guns pointed forward, crews confident in their superiority. He didn't radio for artillery. He simply tipped the nose of his plane downward and dove. The Grasshopper picked up speed in the dive, its engine screaming, wings shuddering. Carpenter had to judge everything by instinct: altitude, angle, distance. Too steep, and he'd overshoot or lose control. Too shallow, and the rockets wouldn't have the velocity to penetrate. At around 500 feet, he flipped the first switch. A bazooka rocket ignited beneath his left wing, streaking toward the lead Panther. The recoil jolted the entire aircraft, but Carpenter held steady. He fired again and again. 2 of the rockets found their mark. The lead tank erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. The second Panther took a hit on its engine deck and ground to a halt, smoke billowing. The remaining tanks scattered, their crews frantically searching for the source of the attack, but seeing only a small spotter plane climbing away. Carpenter returned to base, landed, and immediately had Rosie rearmed. He went back up that same afternoon and hit the column again, this time destroying another tank and disabling an armored personnel carrier. By the end of the day, German radio chatter was full of confused reports about airborne anti-tank attacks. They didn't understand what was happening. How could such a small plane carry that kind of firepower? Word spread quickly among Allied forces. Bazooka Charlie had just invented a new kind of warfare, and he was only getting started. Carpenter's most significant contribution came during the Battle of Arracourt in late September of 1944, one of the largest tank battles on the Western Front. German forces, desperate to stop the American advance into Lorraine, committed the 5th Panzer Army to a massive counteroffensive. Hundreds of Panther and Panzer IV tanks rolled toward the American positions held by the 4th Armored Division. The American tank crews were outnumbered and, in many cases, outgunned. German Panthers had thicker armor and more powerful cannons than the American Shermans. The battle quickly devolved into brutal close-range engagements across the rolling hills and forests around Arracourt. American commanders called for every available asset, artillery, tank destroyers, air support, to stem the German tide. Carpenter flew mission after mission during those desperate days. He'd take off at first light, hunt for German tank formations, dive on them with his rockets, return to base for a rapid reload, and go back out again. Sometimes he flew 4 or 5 sorties in a single day. His tactics evolved with experience. He learned to approach from the sun, using the glare to mask his dive. He learned which parts of a tank were most vulnerable: the engine compartment, the turret ring, the ammunition storage. He learned to fire in salvos rather than single shots, overwhelming a target with multiple impacts. The Germans adapted too. They started posting lookouts specifically to watch for his little plane. Anti-aircraft guns were redirected to deal with him, but Carpenter kept coming back. On one mission, he destroyed 3 Panthers in a single pass, then circled around and knocked out a 4th on his way back to base. On another, he caught a German column in the open and disabled 6 vehicles before they could reach cover. The official records credit Carpenter with destroying at least 6 German tanks during the battle, along with numerous half-tracks, trucks, and armored cars. But his impact went beyond the numbers. Every time he appeared, German tank crews hesitated, looking skyward instead of focusing on the American armor in front of them. The psychological effect was devastating. The invincible Panther, pride of the German panzer forces, could be knocked out by a plane that looked like it belonged at a county fair. Arracourt ended in a decisive American victory, one of the most lopsided tank battles of the entire war. Carpenter's contributions didn't turn the tide alone, but they mattered. They saved American lives. They changed how people thought about what was possible in combat. After Arracourt, Carpenter continued his tank hunting missions through the fall and winter of 1944. He became something of a legend among Allied forces and a nightmare for German tank crews. Intelligence reports intercepted German radio traffic, specifically warning about the small American spotter plane with rockets. Some German units refused to move during daylight hours if Carpenter was known to be in the area. But the job took its toll. Every mission was a calculated risk. The Grasshopper remained as fragile as ever, and German anti-aircraft defenses were getting better at targeting him. On several occasions, Carpenter returned to base with his plane riddled with bullet holes, fabric wings torn, control cables barely intact. He crash-landed at least once after taking ground fire that damaged his engine. Each time he walked away, had Rosie patched up and went back out. His fellow pilots thought he was either the bravest man in the Army or completely insane. Probably both. But Carpenter saw it differently. To him, every tank he destroyed meant American soldiers who wouldn't face that tank on the ground. Every mission was personal. He'd seen what German armor did to infantry caught in the open. If he could stop even one of those machines, the risk was worth it. By the time the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, Carpenter had logged hundreds of combat hours in Rosie the Rocketer. His official tally included 6 confirmed tank kills, but the actual number was likely higher. Battlefield chaos made precise accounting impossible. He'd also destroyed or disabled dozens of other vehicles, disrupted countless German movements, and pioneered tactics that would influence close air support doctrine for decades to come. He survived the war without serious injury, a minor miracle given how many times he'd put himself in harm's way. Rosie the Rocketer survived too, battered and patched but still flying. After victory in Europe was declared, Carpenter flew her home. Charles Carpenter returned to Illinois after the war, back to teaching, back to the quiet life of a civilian. He rarely spoke about his combat missions. To him, he'd simply done what needed to be done, nothing more. The Army awarded him the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters. Official citations praised his extraordinary heroism and aggressive spirit, but Carpenter deflected the praise. He'd just been trying to help, he said. Anyone would have done the same. History remembers him differently. Bazooka. Charlie stands as a testament to the power of individual initiative in warfare, to the idea that sometimes the most effective solutions come from people willing to question the rules. His modifications to the L-4 Grasshopper anticipated the development of dedicated ground attack aircraft and attack helicopters. Modern close air support owes something to that schoolteacher from Illinois who decided his observation plane could be more than just a set of eyes in the sky. Carpenter passed away in 1966 at the age of 53, far too young, his wartime service largely forgotten by a nation that had moved on to other conflicts. But among military historians and aviation enthusiasts, his legend endures. Rosie the Rocketer survived him, eventually finding her way to a museum where visitors can see the improvised rocket tubes still mounted on her wings, a reminder of what one determined man accomplished with ingenuity, courage, and 6 bazookas strapped to a fabric-covered plane. In the end, perhaps that's the real lesson of Bazooka Charlie, that heroism doesn't always come from following orders or using the right equipment. Sometimes it comes from a teacher who becomes a pilot who becomes an innovator, and an innovator who becomes a hunter, diving alone into the teeth of the enemy because someone had to and no one else would.